Welcome, everyone, to another deep dive. Before we even really get into the introduction today, do us a quick favor and just hit that like button and subscribe to the channel right now.
Yeah, you're definitely going to want to be subscribed for this one.
Exactly. We have got an incredibly intense, highly detailed exploration lined up for you today, and you are not going to want to miss any of the content we put out here. Today, we are bringing you an exclusive review and analysis of a highly provocative new ebook.
Highly provocative is putting it mildly, I think.
Right, yeah. It's titled Submission, Female Islamism, and it's by Conrad Riker. And really quickly, if you want to follow along, verify the data we are discussing, or just read the source material for yourself, you can check out Amazon Kindle and Google Play Books to buy the book.
And we also highly recommend you follow the author directly. His handle is @Conrad Riker on Substack.
Yes, definitely do that. So jumping in, this text, it is a massive, densely packed book.
It covers just an enormous amount of ground. He's drawing from evolutionary biology, historical analysis, complex legal frameworks, and tons of global sociological data. The scope of what the author is attempting to synthesize here is genuinely staggering.
It really is, which is exactly why we need to be very clear right up front about our mission today and exactly who this deep dive is custom tailored for. Because if you are someone who is interested in the men's rights movement, or if you follow the manosphere, or if you simply want a deep alternative understanding of how modern institutions evolved.
And specifically how they were allegedly captured by feminist and Marxist ideologies.
Right, exactly. If that's you, this book is an absolute must-read. The author has designed this text to basically function as both a wake-up call and a survival manual for men trying to navigate the modern structural landscape.
And that specific focus brings us to a mandatory, frankly crucial disclaimer that we just have to establish with you before we venture any further into this material.
Yeah, we have to lay the ground rules.
Exactly. The contents of this ebook are highly polarizing. It contains very politically charged arguments and perspectives that aggressively challenge the very foundation of modern Western social norms. It goes after egalitarianism and contemporary gender dynamics hard.
And that is the crystal clear boundary we are drawing today. We are not taking sides here.
Right. We are not endorsing the viewpoints presented in the book, nor are we here to condemn them or, offer some kind of moral critique.
Our sole purpose on this deep dive is to impartially report, unpack, and synthesize the author's arguments. We want to give you, the listener, a comprehensive understanding of the exact ideas contained in the text. We're going to look at the architecture of his worldview, allowing you to examine the logic and the data totally for yourself.
Think of this as an exercise in structural analysis. We are going to examine the foundation the author builds regarding biological dominance, and then how he traces that through the evolution and subsequent critique of modern institutions like schools and courts.
And finally, we'll look at the highly controversial societal solutions he proposes, which heavily involve Islamic frameworks, polygyny, and decentralized underground movements.
Yeah, the solutions section is intense.
So, to start at the very bedrock of the manuscript, the early chapters completely bypass modern sociology. He just ignores it. The text comes out of the gate with a core premise that really sets the stage for every subsequent argument, and that premise is that male leadership, according to the author, is absolutely not a social construct.
Right, he argues it is pure, unadulterated biology.
The phrasing he uses in the text is quite stark. He basically says that biology doesn't care about your feelings, it only cares about survival.
And the methodology he uses to establish this is fascinating because he relies heavily on primatology and anthropology rather than, say, modern psychological surveys.
Right.
For instance, he devotes a really significant amount of space to Jane Goodall's famous observations of a chimpanzee named Frodo.
Oh yeah, the Frodo stuff is wild.
It is. The text notes that when Frodo ruled the Gombe Strom Reserve, he didn't achieve that position through consensus building, right? Or empathy. He maintained absolute order through sheer physical presence, intimidation, and the strategic formation of male coalitions.
Basically, the argument being made here is that in the primate world from which humans evolved, obviously leadership is inevitably established by the strongest, most aggressive males, specifically those with the highest testosterone levels.
Exactly, and the book draws a direct, unbroken line from those primate observations right to the dawn of humanity, pulling heavily from hunter-gatherer burial records.
Yeah, the author claims that archaeological evidence consistently shows high-status males being buried with weapons, indicating very clear command and martial roles.
While female burials, by contrast, often show signs of deep community respect or ceremonial importance, but the text argues they rarely, if ever, indicate that women held positions of martial command or ultimate societal authority.
For the author, this is empirical proof that patriarchy wasn't some artificial ideology cooked up in a smoky boardroom to oppress women. He frames it as the mechanism of natural selection in action.
And if we follow that thread into the modern era, the text places an immense, almost foundational focus on testosterone itself.
Right. He doesn't just view it as a hormone responsible for muscle mass.
Not at all. He views it as the biological fuel that gives human beings the capacity to face catastrophic failure and make hard, incredibly unpopular decisions.
And to illustrate this point in a contemporary setting, the book draws this really stark, detailed contrast between two major Silicon Valley figures, Elizabeth Holmes, the founder of the disgraced blood testing startup Theranos, and Peter Thiel, the co-founder of PayPal.
That comparison takes up a fascinating portion of the text. The argument posits that Elizabeth Holmes essentially attempted to counterfeit male strength.
Yeah, he talks about how she artificially lowered her vocal register.
Right. And adopted the utilitarian uniform of black turtlenecks to mimic Steve Jobs, projecting this impenetrable stoic aura. But the crucial difference, according to the author, emerged when the company faced an existential crisis.
When the technology failed.
Exactly. The text argues that Holmes didn't pivot or restructure. She hid, she relied on emotional manipulation, and she lied to investors.
And the author then contrasts that failure with the early days of PayPal under Peter Thiel, because PayPal faced massive, near-fatal stumbles early on, right? Including catastrophic issues with fraud and the Russian mafia.
Yeah, and instead of hiding, the text points out that Thiel faced the failures head-on. He admitted the fundamental flaws in their model, aggressively fired people, restructured the entire company, and ultimately built an empire.
The author uses this specific juxtaposition to assert that feminized decision-making, which he characterizes as prioritizing inclusion, appearances, and feelings over brutal, unvarnished results, inevitably leads to institutional collapse.
He argues that testosterone is an essential ingredient for institutional survival because it allows a leader to be entirely comfortable with being hated.
Right, and that strictly biological, evolutionary perspective feeds directly into how the author completely dismantles what he refers to as the, quote, feminist lie of the gender pay gap.
He dedicates a substantial portion of the text to this. He argues that the wage gap is a complete intentional fabrication designed to foster perpetual grievance.
This is a major structural pillar of his critique against modern egalitarianism. The text tackles that widely cited, culturally ubiquitous statistic that women earn 79 cents for every dollar men earn.
The author argues this is an intentional mathematical misrepresentation of reality. And to counter it, he cites a highly detailed 2023 Congressional Budget Office report.
According to his breakdown of that data, when you actually run a regression analysis that controls for the exact same job title, the exact same hours worked per week, full-time continuous status, and unbroken years of experience, that 79-cent gap shrinks dramatically to 98 cents.
And to really drive the mechanics of this home, the text emphasizes that men work 52% more overtime than women, drawing on data from the Bureau of Labor Statistics.
Plus, the author points out that men disproportionately take on hazardous duty. Jobs on deep-sea oil rigs, commercial logging, underwater welding.
Jobs which carry high mortality rates and therefore command massive premium pay. The book uses a very specific, memorable analogy here to illustrate how statistical averages obscure individual reality.
I love this analogy.
Yeah, the author asks you to imagine a female cardiothoracic surgeon who earns $500,000 a year. Now, picture a male pediatrician who earns $470,000 a year.
Right. In this scenario, the woman is earning significantly more than the man.
And the underlying logic of that analogy is that behavioral choices, risk tolerance, and biological priorities, not systemic, invisible sexism dictate aggregate pay disparities.
The author argues that women, on average, often choose fields that offer more flexibility, or they choose to prioritize family over working, grueling 80-hour night shifts.
While men, conversely, are biologically driven to sacrifice their health and time for resource accumulation to attract mates. Therefore, the text concludes that the pay disparity is merely a mathematical reflection of biological differences and lifestyle choices.
The conclusion he draws from this is incredibly sharp. He argues that by portraying women as perpetual victims of a systemic wage gap, modern movements are actually demanding supremacy and equal outcomes without being willing to match the equal, often life-shortening sacrifice that men make in the labor market.
But the text doesn't confine this biological critique merely to the workplace. It spends a significant amount of time exploring the erosion of social contracts, specifically focusing on the death of chivalry.
Yes, and he grounds this sociological argument in a very specific personal anecdote to open the chapter. He describes being 19 years old in Chicago, holding a door open for a woman at a coffee shop.
And instead of receiving a simple acknowledgement, he claims the woman glared at him and aggressively snapped that she was perfectly capable of opening her own door.
Leaving him standing there looking foolish, while a barista smirked at the interaction.
Right. And for the author, this wasn't just a rude, isolated encounter. He frames it as a symbolic realization that being a traditional gentleman is no longer rewarded by modern society. It is actively, culturally punished.
To back up that cultural shift with data, he points to a YouGov poll claiming that 82% of men under the age of 30 now refuse to open doors, offer their coats, or intervene in minor disputes because they are terrified of being labeled toxic, patronizing, or creepy.
But what is most fascinating about this section is how he dives deep into the medieval historical context of chivalry to prove that its original intent was never about oppressing women, which is, the common modern critique. He references the 1139 Council of Clermont.
The inclusion of the Council of Clermont is a vital piece of his historical architecture here.
Yeah, the author asserts that chivalry was never invented to place women on a restrictive, patronizing pedestal. If you look at the historical context of the 12th century, Europe was incredibly violent and chaotic.
Chivalry was conceived as a blood-forged social contract designed to stop heavily armed, highly aggressive men from simply pillaging, murdering, and taking whatever they wanted by force.
Exactly. Knights swore sacred oaths to protect women, the clergy, and the peasantry. The author argues this code was literally the thin red line between civilized order and total, brutal anarchy.
And the text argues that modern sociology has completely misunderstood this survival mechanism. By attacking what academics now call benevolent sexism, which is the sociological term used to describe men opening doors, paying for dates, or acting as protectors, the author claims society has actively destroyed the very social glue that kept the worst impulses of men in check.
That is exactly the author's point. He calls benevolent sexism a linguistic trap. His logic dictates that if every positive, protective male behavior that acknowledges biological differences is treated with suspicion or hostility, men will simply disengage.
They will stop policing their own behavior.
And more importantly, they will stop policing the behavior of predatory men. To substantiate this claim, the text points to modern Europe. The author cites statistics claiming that since Berlin implemented aggressive, progressive policies in 2015, including campaigns that criminalized unwanted flirtation and sought to erase traditional gender dynamics in public spaces, reports of public sexual harassment and assaults on public transit have actually risen by 300%.
The stark conclusion of this section is that when you dismantle the natural biological order of chivalry, you do not achieve a utopian freedom. You get chaos, a rise in opportunistic predators, and widespread societal paranoia.
Right.
So if we accept his premise that biology dictates male leadership and that chivalry was the vital social contract keeping chaos at bay, the natural next question the book asks is, what happens when those elements are systematically hunted down and removed from our modern institutions?
And that perfectly transitions the text into an intense critique of how schools, courts, and corporations have been fundamentally altered. The author's critique of the modern education system is relentless.
He views the contemporary classroom not as an environment of genuine learning or intellectual exploration, but as a highly controlled behavior modification lab.
According to the text, natural male traits such as physical competitiveness, high kinetic energy, and the deeply ingrained instinct to establish hierarchies are no longer viewed as normal developmental stages.
Instead, they are treated by predominantly female teaching staffs as symptoms of a psychological disease that must be heavily medicated and cured.
And he brings some incredibly heavy, sobering data to back up this claim of institutional hostility toward boys. He points out that male college enrollment has absolutely plummeted by 40% since the year 2000.
He also takes direct aim at the legacy of Title IX, while acknowledging it was originally sold to the public as a way to boost female athletic participation. He argues its practical application effectively gutted male sports programs due to proportionality requirements.
He notes that the percentage of high school boys participating in sports dropped from 68% in 1980 down to just 41% today.
This demographic shift raises a crucial question within the framework of the book. If boys are being pushed out of competitive physical arenas, what is replacing that culture?
The author argues that boys are being subjected to a process of psychological disarmament. And to illustrate the extreme logical endpoint of this ideology, he points to what he terms the Swedish paradox.
Let's unpack that Swedish paradox because it's a fascinating case study in the text. He looks at Sweden's state-funded, highly experimental, gender-neutral preschools.
The book notes that these institutions literally banned the usage of pronouns like boy and girl, replacing traditional toys with gender-neutral objects, and attempting to entirely erase any biological gender norms from the critical early childhood developmental window.
And the text is quick to highlight the measurable results of this sociological experiment. The author cites educational data suggesting that in these highly controlled gender-neutral environments, boys are now lagging in basic literacy by 2 full grade levels compared to historical averages.
Furthermore, ADHD diagnoses and the subsequent prescription of stimulant medications among boys in these systems have spiked by 60%.
For the author, this is damning proof that boys aren't inherently broken or diseased. Rather, they are being suffocated by an ideological system that punishes their biological reality. He refers to this entire educational framework as cultural castration.
Moving from the classroom directly into the boardroom, the text tackles the corporate world, taking specific aggressive aim at the modern corporate obsession with emotional intelligence, or EI.
Emotional intelligence, which was popularized in the cultural zeitgeist by Daniel Goleman's 1995 bestseller, is viewed by the author as a complete Trojan horse within the corporate sphere.
While EI is universally sold as a tool for fostering empathy, better communication, and holistic management, the text argues it is actually an insidious HR weapon.
According to the author, EI is designed to enforce strict behavioral compliance and to pathologize traditional stoic masculinity in the workplace. The argument is that the modern corporate world now demands and worships vulnerability, but only a very specific HR-approved type of vulnerability.
Right. If a male executive remains stoic, detached, and entirely focused on metrics during a corporate crisis, the text claims he is inevitably deemed toxic, unapproachable, or emotionally repressed.
The author strongly champions classical stoicism over emotional intelligence, arguing that true stoicism isn't the repression of emotion, it is the absolute mastery of it in service of a goal.
And to contextualize this shift within the life cycle of organizations, the author relies heavily on a concept known as Bruce Brenner de Mesquita's iron law of institutions.
For those unfamiliar, this political science theory suggests that organizations inevitably reach a tipping point where the people managing the institution begin to prioritize their own self-preservation, bureaucratic expansion, and internal power over the actual founding mission of the institution itself.
And the author takes that established iron law and maps gender directly onto it. He claims that institutions that become dominated by female leadership or feminine HR principles like modern universities or sprawling NGOs inevitably fall victim to this law.
They begin to prioritize infinite bureaucracy, emotional safety, and diversity initiatives over actual innovation.
He contrasts that with male-led, engineering-focused institutions like SpaceX or early Apple, which he claims ruthlessly prioritize conquest, tangible output, and empirical results over the feelings of their employees.
The ultimate contemporary case study he provides to solidify this point is Elon Musk's highly controversial takeover of Twitter.
Yes. The author frames Musk's actions specifically walking into Twitter headquarters and terminating roughly 80% of the global staff over a single weekend, not as the erratic disaster the media portrayed it as, but as a necessary, brilliant demolition of emotional bureaucracy.
According to the text, Musk didn't care about employee emotional intelligence, he didn't care about empathy, and he didn't care about the internal culture of the company. He only cared about function and engineering output.
The author points out that by clearing away the massive layers of DEI officers, content moderators, and the obsessive focus on internal emotional safety, Musk returned the company to a state of functional hierarchical command.
The book argues this ruthless focus on survival over sentiment is the very essence of necessary male leadership.
But the text is quick to point out that men who attempt to lead, enforce boundaries, or maintain traditional order are facing threats far more severe than just corporate HR departments.
Right.
They are facing the full weaponized weight of the legal system. This is detailed extensively in the chapters dealing with what the author calls the legal assault on men.
This is where the book dives deeply into modern family law and the evolution of domestic abuse statutes. The author traces the current legal framework back to a highly influential 2007 book by feminist legal theorist Evan Stark, titled Coercive Control.
Stark's work fundamentally shifted the legal landscape by arguing that domestic abuse isn't merely physical violence. It can include psychological manipulation, financial restriction, and emotional dominance.
And the author argues that this concept of coercive control has been completely weaponized by the state against men. He points to specific, sweeping legislation like the US iSafe Act and the UK's Gender Recognition Act, alongside various regional coercive control statutes.
The primary critique the text levies against these laws is that they possess absolutely no peer-reviewed diagnostic tools or objective evidentiary standards. Instead, they rely almost entirely on the subjective feelings and uncorroborated interpretations of the accuser.
The profound danger here, according to the author's logic, is that these laws effectively criminalize normal, traditional male responsibility and leadership within a household.
The book gives several chilling hypothetical examples. A husband asking his wife to strictly budget the grocery money because they are in debt, or a father sternly insisting that his children finish their homework before they are allowed to play video games.
Right, and the author argues those actions can now be legally framed by a hostile partner as financial abuse, emotional dominance, or coercive control.
The text views this legal evolution as a system of gendered totalitarianism. It argues that male behavior is now heavily surveilled and policed by the state, while women are shielded from almost all accountability and given the terrifying power to completely destroy a man's life, reputation, and freedom with a single subjective accusation.
The author notes that men in modern divorce courts are overwhelmingly presumed guilty, systematically stripped of their assets, and separated from their children simply because the legal system now assumes that any expression of male authority is inherently abusive.
So, if we follow the book's narrative arc, if the West has criminalized natural male leadership, pathologized boys in schools, and weaponized the courts against fathers, what is the author's alternative?
Which leads us into the third major section of the text, which undoubtedly contains the most controversial paradigm-shifting material in the entire book.
The arguments surrounding natural submission, the mechanics of polygyny, and what he calls the last true patriarchy.
The author certainly does not shy away from controversy here. He presents the explosive claim that women, on a fundamental biological level, naturally desire submission, and that forcing the modern concept of egalitarianism upon them actively damages their psychological well-being because it goes against their evolutionary hardwiring.
The phrase he uses is that submission isn't oppression, it is neurochemical bliss.
And to attempt to prove this, he utilizes a mix of sociological history and modern neuroscience. First, he examines the historical failure of forced egalitarianism, specifically looking at the commune movements in the West.
He focuses heavily on Twin Oaks, a famous 1970s intentional community in Virginia that explicitly and aggressively tried to erase all gender roles.
In this commune, men were socially forced to perform emotional labor, suppress any dominant instincts, and share all leadership equally.
The text claims the ultimate result of this experiment was total societal dysfunction, deep-seated resentment, and a collapse of community cohesion.
The author's interpretation is that the men felt completely neutered and aimless, while the women, stripped of strong, decisive male leadership, felt profoundly unsafe and anxious.
The book then contrasts that failed Western sociological experiment with the enduring stability of strict patriarchal societies. He points to the United Arab Emirates, noting its incredibly high GDP per capita, its virtually non-existent crime rate, and its ranking as one of the most socially stable nations on Earth.
The author argues this stability isn't in spite of their strict adherence to male guardianship laws, but precisely because of them.
And to ground these sociological observations in hard science, the author references a fascinating 2021 neuroimaging study conducted at the University of Zurich.
According to his detailed interpretation of the brain scans in this study, when women willingly defer to established male authority in decision-making scenarios, the reward and pleasure centers of their brains visibly light up, releasing dopamine and serotonin.
Conversely, when the study forced women to actively challenge male leadership or take on the dominant burden of the decision themselves, stress regions like the amygdala aggressively activated, causing significant spikes in cortisol, the body's primary stress hormone.
The author pairs that human neuroimaging data with a return to Franz de Waal's chimpanzee studies. He points out that female chimps actively and consistently seek out the strongest, most dominant, and often most aggressive males for physical protection and superior genetics.
The rhetorical question the text poses is this: why are we supposed to believe that human women, who share roughly 98% of their DNA with these primates, somehow evolved to desire the exact opposite? A weak, overly empathetic, submissive male partner.
The author posits that deep down in their evolutionary programming, women crave strict order and unwavering leadership. He argues that the modern feminist project has left women chronically anxious, heavily medicated with antidepressants, and deeply isolated, precisely because it forces them to fight a daily war against their own biological nature.
And this biological argument serves as the foundation for the author's strong endorsement of traditional Islam.
Yes, for the author, traditional Islam is viewed not just as a religion, but as the absolute last remaining ideological fortress that honestly acknowledges biological reality and unapologetically maintains necessary male authority.
He frequently cites specific scripture, notably Quran 4.34, which designates men as qawamun, a term that translates to the protectors, maintainers, and financial providers of women.
The text is careful to argue that this concept of qawamun isn't about arbitrary abuse or tyranny. It's about a divine and biological decree of necessary order.
The author uses this framework to aggressively challenge the prevailing Western media narratives which portray Muslim women as being uniformly oppressed by these structures.
To support this counter-narrative, he brings up a comprehensive 2023 poll conducted by Gammon, an independent research group focusing on Iran.
This poll is a critical data point for his argument. While Western media coverage of Iran focuses almost exclusively on anti-hijab protests and systemic rebellion, the author notes that this extensive internal poll showed that 64% of Iranian women actually actively support the mandatory wearing of the hijab.
The author's interpretation of this data is profound. He argues that these women view the hijab and the patriarchal structure it represents not as a tool of oppression, but as an essential shield.
He claims it protects them from the relentless, hyper-competitive, deeply superficial sexual marketplace that completely exhausts Western women.
In the author's view, traditional Islamic structures offer women profound psychological relief from the impossible modern demands of having to be ruthless corporate breadwinners, perfect maternal caregivers, and flawless sexual objects all at the exact same time.
And that concept of the sexual marketplace leads us directly into what is undoubtedly the most provocative chapter of the entire manuscript.
The author takes his arguments regarding biological male dominion to their ultimate logical conclusion, an extensive defense of polygyny, exploring why, in his words, one wife is never enough for a high-value man.
The author's core thesis here is that mandatory state-enforced monogamy is an entirely unnatural state. He argues it is a system artificially imposed upon highly successful men by governments that are fundamentally terrified of unchecked masculine power and wealth accumulation.
He approaches the defense of polygyny from two distinct angles: evolutionary biology and macro-societal stability.
On the biological front, the text draws heavily on David Buss's landmark 1994 book, The Evolution of Desire. The author points out that Buss's research, which spanned 37 distinct human cultures, proves beyond a shadow of a doubt that men are biologically hardwired to seek multiple sexual partners in order to maximize their genetic reproductive potential.
The book frames polygyny not as some immoral hedonistic quirk, but as nature's explicit intended blueprint for male success.
But where the author really pushes the envelope is his assertion that polygyny actually creates vastly superior outcomes for women and for society as a whole.
To support this highly counterintuitive claim, he cites a 2020 World Health Organization report focusing on specific regions of West Africa where polygyny remains a common, culturally accepted practice.
The author highlights data from this report claiming that clinical female depression rates in these polygynous societies are actually 40% lower than the rates found in strictly monogamous Western nations.
When I first read that statistic in the text, it seemed completely paradoxical. How does the author explain the mechanics of why depression would be measurably lower in a system where women share a husband?
The author provides a deeply sociological explanation for this. He argues that in a functioning polygynous system, women are embedded within massive, highly supportive, interconnected kinship networks. They share the burdens of child rearing, domestic management, and emotional support.
He contrasts this with the modern Western model, where women are often profoundly isolated in a nuclear family setup, or worse, struggling entirely alone as single mothers juggling careers and children without a safety net.
Furthermore, the book argues that polygyny completely destroys modern feminist leverage by mathematically reintroducing intense, merit-based competition among women.
The text claims that if high-value, resource-rich men have the legal and cultural option to simply marry multiple women, they no longer have to tolerate emotional blackmail, constant nagging, or the looming ruinous threat of a modern Western divorce.
Exactly. The author argues that in a polygynous dynamic, the wives must constantly compete based on their actual ability to provide peace, raise strong, respectful children, and support the overarching mission of the husband.
If a specific wife fails to do so, or becomes highly combative, the author notes she is simply rotated out of favor and replaced by the companionship of another, more cooperative wife.
The book argues that this harsh but natural accountability forces women to heavily police their own behavior, leading to significantly stronger family cohesion and dramatically lower divorce rates.
And for those listening who might not be deeply embedded in evolutionary biology or manosphere terminology, we should pause and define a concept the author relies on heavily here: hypergamy.
Hypergamy is the biological and sociological tendency for women to seek out and marry men who are of higher status, higher wealth, or higher physical dominance than themselves.
The author argues that polygyny perfectly satisfies female hypergamy, because instead of settling for a low-status monogamous man, multiple women can share the resources and genetics of an apex high-status male.
And the author believes this dynamic solves massive existential societal crises. To prove this, he points to the modern incel phenomenon in the West.
Incels, or involuntarily celibate men, are a growing demographic of low-status men who are entirely locked out of the dating market and who often harbor deep, dangerous resentments toward society.
The author contrasts this Western crisis with China's looming demographic disaster of 30 million bare branches unmarried men who literally cannot find partners due to the systemic gender imbalances caused by the historical one-child policy.
The book claims that in robustly polygynous societies, there is effectively no incel crisis. The author points to the Maasai chiefs in Kenya as a prime example. These high-status chiefs successfully manage massive wealth and multiple wives.
The text argues that in these societies, the high-status men absorb the women into stable, well-resourced familial units.
The lower-status men are forced to either dramatically improve their value through hard work and martial prowess to earn a wife, or they submit to the hierarchy.
Either way, the author argues it maintains strict social order and prevents the chaotic, violent resentment we see brewing in isolated Western men.
He literally refers to polygyny as the nuclear option against feminist ideology, precisely because it completely shatters the fundamental illusion that men must beg for intimacy, compromise their boundaries, or ask for state permission to reproduce and build a dynasty.
So, the author has meticulously painted this stark, unyielding contrast between the chaotic, medicated reality of Western egalitarianism and the highly structured biological order of Islamic and patriarchal systems.
This framing perfectly transitions the text into its fourth section, which relies heavily on global data to analyze what he terms the collapse of the West versus patriarchal resilience.
The author uses extensive global economic and demographic data to argue that the West is essentially, and perhaps irreversibly, following the historical trajectory of fallen empires.
To illustrate the endgame of progressive policies, he uses Japan as his ultimate terrifying cautionary tale. He doesn't view Japan as the high-tech economic miracle it was once touted as. He views it as a dying society, suffocated by imported feminist policies.
The statistics he pulls to illustrate the decline of Japan are incredibly bleak. He notes that Japan's birth rate has plummeted to a catastrophic 1.2 children per woman, which is far below the population replacement rate.
He describes how rural infrastructure is collapsing and entire villages are becoming literal ghost towns.
He points specifically to the sociological phenomenon of karoshi, which translates to death by overwork. He describes a culture where the traditional male salaryman is physically and psychologically crushed by his corporate obligations, yet receives absolutely no respect, authority, or legacy when he returns home.
The author doesn't blame this collapse on mere economic stagnation. He blames it directly on the Gender Equality Bureau, which was established by the Japanese government in 1999 and modeled heavily on Western feminist ideals.
He claims this bureaucratic entity fundamentally altered the social fabric overnight. By importing progressive ideology, he argues the government turned men from revered protectors and providers into presumed predators.
Workplaces were suddenly flooded with Western-style sensitivity training, and schools began actively punishing the competitive, boisterous male behavior that had previously driven Japan's economic dominance.
And the ultimate result, according to the data presented in the text, is that Japanese men simply looked at the new rigged social contract and collectively opted out.
Marriage rates have hit unprecedented historic lows. The author cites fascinating market data showing that sales of male skincare and cosmetic products in Japan rose by astonishing 27% between 2015 and 2022.
The argument here is that men, stripped of their traditional roles as patriarchs, are retreating from society entirely. They're spending their disposable income on narcissistic serums, isolating themselves in their apartments, or in extreme cases, literally marrying artificial intelligence digital holograms rather than engaging in a modern dating market that the author claims offers them infinite liability and zero authority.
The crisis has become so acute that the text notes the Japanese government has been forced to desperately spend 10 billion yen on a state-sponsored matchmaking campaign titled, ironically, Love is War.
The author has a brutal quote regarding that government initiative. He calls it subsidizing breathing because a population was forcefully taught to forget how to inhale.
He argues that when a state actively shames natural masculinity while simultaneously glorifying female hypergamy and independence, it inevitably builds a civilization comprised entirely of lonely, atomized men and empty, silent cradles.
But then, the text executes a massive pivot. After detailing the decay of Japan and the broader West, the author fires off a rapid succession of data points from nations around the globe that have actively legally embraced traditional patriarchal structures.
The author uses these specific examples to prove that his theories aren't just academic musings. They have real-world, measurable, life-saving success.
Let's run through these examples carefully because the geopolitical scope of his argument is vast. First, he looks at Eastern Europe, specifically Poland. He notes that in 2022, Poland passed a controversial Fathers' Rights Act.
This legislation essentially granted men automatic 50-50 physical custody in the event of a divorce, unless the man was explicitly proven unfit by hard evidence.
And the data he ties to this is crucial. The text claims that in the years immediately following the enactment of this law, the male suicide rate in Poland dropped by a staggering 19%, while marriage rates actually rose by 12%.
The author argues this is empirical proof that when you restore legal male authority and remove the constant looming threat of a man losing his children to a biased court, you directly save male lives and encourage family formation.
Next, he points to Hungary under the leadership of Viktor Orban. The text details how Orban has aggressively enacted policies that promote strict traditional Christian family values while simultaneously banning certain progressive gender-fluid content from being taught in public schools.
The author notes that as a direct result of these policies, Hungary's birth rate rose to 1.68 by 2023. While still below replacement, it is the highest birth rate in the European Union, which the author uses to prove that state-sponsored patriarchal propaganda fundamentally strengthens national demographic resilience.
The book then shifts its focus back to the Islamic world, citing the tiny, wealthy nation of Brunei.
Since the full, uncompromising implementation of strict Sharia law in 2019, which includes incredibly harsh physical punishments for crimes like theft and adultery, the author cites United Nations Office on Drugs and Crime data, showing that Brunei boasts a crime rate of just 0.3 per 1,000 people.
This makes it the safest nation in Southeast Asia. The text uses this to argue that the harsh, unflinching enforcement of traditional moral norms effectively eliminates societal deviance.
The author even pulls data from the African continent to prove his point. He cites a deeply controversial 2015 educational policy implemented in Rwanda.
According to the text, this policy effectively banned the teaching of modern feminist ideology and Western gender studies in state schools.
The author claims that in the academic cycles following this ideological ban, Rwandan male academic performance, specifically in hard sciences and mathematics, increased by an astounding 22%.
Finally, he touches on recent legal shifts in Malaysia and India to demonstrate popular support for these ideas. In Malaysia, he highlights a 2023 Male Guardianship Restoration Act.
This law, which allowed men to legally restrict their wives' international travel without permission, was reportedly supported by 58% of Malaysian women in internal polling.
In India, he points to a monumental Supreme Court decision that effectively decriminalized adultery only for men, while keeping it grounds for divorce if committed by a woman.
The author notes this reaffirmation of biological male sexual privilege was celebrated by a vast majority of Indian men in local polling.
For the author, all of this disparate global data paints an undeniable, mathematically verifiable picture. Nations that suppress natural male dominance inevitably collapse under the weight of their own bureaucracy and low birth rates, while nations that ruthlessly enforce male dominion thrive, maintain order, and protect their citizens.
Which brings us to the final and perhaps most actionable section of the manuscript, the resistance. If the author believes the West is actively collapsing, what exactly are the men who recognize this reality supposed to do about it?
The author's prescription for men living in the West is highly specific and twofold. First, completely disengage from the corrupt economic and social system, and second, begin building parallel, heavily decentralized structures. This is where he delves deeply into the MGTOW movement in chapter 18.
For those unfamiliar with the acronym, MGTOW stands for Men Going Their Own Way. And the text is incredibly careful to draw a massive, bright red line between MGTOW and the incels we discussed earlier.
The author says incels are essentially defeated men. They sit around on internet forums blaming women and society for their own lack of biological success.
MGTOW, on the other hand, are framed by the author as high-value men who have successfully decoded and outsmarted the modern system.
Exactly. The text argues that MGTOW aren't marching in the streets or holding political protests. They are engaging in a silent, devastating strike.
They are simply leaving. They actively refuse to marry, they refuse to cohabitate, and they refuse to participate in a consumer economy that the author claims simultaneously mocks their masculinity while relying entirely on their tax dollars to fund female independence and state welfare.
The author outlines what he calls the AAA model for these specific men: autonomy, assets, and adventure. He describes vast networks of men who are trading off-grid survival tactics, cryptocurrency investment strategies, and legal frameworks designed to maximize their personal, untouchable wealth while completely minimizing their legal liabilities to the state or to any romantic partners.
And the text provides real-world physical examples of this ideological fracture. The most prominent example given is a project known as the Citadel.
According to the book, this is a massive real estate project launching in Greece in 2024. It is described as a 300-acre, heavily fortified private enclave governed entirely by blockchain smart contracts, designed strictly for high-net-worth men.
The foundational rule of the Citadel is that no women are allowed within its borders under any circumstances. The author doesn't view this as a dystopian retreat. He calls it the necessary evolution of male preservation.
But the author is pragmatic enough to know that not every man reading his book has the capital to move to a private, blockchain-governed enclave in the Mediterranean.
For the millions of men who must stay behind in Western nations, he envisions the future of masculinity operating as a decentralized, entirely untraceable digital nervous system. This is where he introduces the fascinating concept of stoic cells.
The description of these stoic cells reads like something straight out of a guerrilla resistance manual. The author describes them as underground, highly vetted, encrypted groups of men.
We are talking about fathers, military veterans, engineers, and mechanics meeting locally in garages, rural barns, and private shooting ranges.
They coordinate entirely via heavily encrypted messaging apps like Signal or Telegram, deliberately avoiding all government oversight or digital surveillance.
The stated purpose of these stoic cells isn't political violence. It is educational subversion. They exist to train the next generation of boys in real, tangible, historically masculine skills. Complex coding, engine mechanics, classical debate, physical fitness, and wilderness survival.
The author argues this underground network is absolutely necessary because the state-run education system is actively trying to neuter these boys.
To prove the state's overt hostility toward traditional male bonding, the text cites a piece of legislation from New York, AB 892. Passed in 2023, the author claims this law explicitly banned gender-stereotyped activities in public schools, effectively outlawing traditional Boy Scout-style outdoor survival programs during school hours because they were deemed non-inclusive.
The author views laws like AB 892 as definitive proof that the modern state is terrified of masculine independence and self-reliance. In response, he actually developed his own statistical metric within the book called the Masculine Suppression Index, or MSI.
This index is designed to track and quantify exactly how hostile different states, corporations, and academic institutions are toward traditional male expression.
The stoic cells are presented as his direct physical answer to a rising MSI, a covert way to build unbreakable, highly capable sons entirely outside the reach and indoctrination of the state apparatus.
This comprehensive blueprint for resistance brings us to the epilogue of the manuscript, which serves as the author's final, entirely uncompromising call to action for the reader. He distills his entire sprawling thesis down to a single demand that men must immediately stop apologizing for their biological nature.
The advice he gives in these final pages is incredibly granular and practical. He tells the listener to start in their own home, establish rigid, unyielding boundaries, and unapologetically reclaim your authority as the patriarch.
In the workplace, he instructs men to actively, verbally refuse to participate in corporate diversity training, or what he calls feminist HR rituals, even if it costs them their jobs.
Regarding children, he is crystal clear. If your daughter's school brings in progressive, woke speakers or attempts to teach gender fluidity, you must pull her out of that institution immediately, regardless of the logistical difficulty.
He urges men to utilize social media networks not to complain or vent, but to aggressively spread these biological truths and challenge the prevailing egalitarian narrative at every opportunity.
The author frames this entire endeavor not as a simple cultural shift or a political disagreement, but as a literal existential war for biological survival. He tells his readers that they do not need society's permission to lead. They possess the evolutionary and, in his view, the divine right to dominate, and they must act immediately before the demographic collapse of the West becomes mathematically irreversible.
It is a relentlessly intense, highly polarizing text. Whether you agree with the evolutionary biology presented or you find the proposed solutions regarding polygyny and Islamic frameworks completely abhorrent, there's simply no denying the sheer density of the arguments, the historical sweep, and the vast array of global data points that Conrad Riker has assembled in submission. Female Islamism.
It is a manuscript that forcefully requires the reader to confront foundational, often uncomfortable questions about the true nature of biological gender, the life cycle and capture of modern institutions, and the ultimate long-term trajectory of Western civilization.
Which brings us to the end of our incredibly deep dive today. But before we sign off, we always want to leave you with a final provocative thought to mull over on your own, something that builds directly on the architecture of the text we've just explored, but looks just a bit further down the road into the future.
Consider the very real phenomenon of the Citadel Project in Greece and the growing network of these underground Stoic cells. If parallel, self-sustaining societies continue to grow and operate completely outside the traditional mainstream institutions, utilizing encrypted communications, untraceable blockchain governance, and sovereign private land to entirely bypass the state apparatus, what does this fracture mean for the future of global societal cohesion?
Are we currently witnessing the early, irreversible stages of a permanent splitting of human civilization? Will we see the world cleanly divide into entirely separate, highly fortified ideological ecosystems that no longer share the same legal frameworks, the same educational realities, or even the same physical geography? If the author is right about the biological drive of men to seek autonomy, it is a staggering, potentially inevitable possibility to consider.
It certainly is. The implications for the survival of the traditional nation-state and for any concept of global unity are incredibly profound.
Well, you certainly have a massive amount of material to think about today. Remember, if you want to verify the data, examine the studies we discussed, or read the source material for yourself, please check out Amazon Kindle and Google Play Books to buy the ebook, Submission: Female Islamism by Conrad Riker. And be sure to follow the author at Conrad Riker on Substack for more of his ongoing writings and research.
We hope we've provided you with a clear, comprehensively detailed, and structurally objective analysis of the text today.
Thank you so much for taking this extensive deep dive with us. Please remind yourself to hit that like button and subscribe to the channel right now so you never miss a future exploration. Until next time, keep questioning the narratives, keep learning, and keep diving deep.